Hi everyone. I'm going to read the introduction to Little Red Riding Hood, but a version that I've retold and will be published soon, a version from the Australian outback. This is how my introduction goes. Yassine Warragul must have been in his late 40s when I first met him. A great hulking bear of a man, his hands and feet were so hefty that I found myself wondering whether they had been enlarged by some miraculous process. A friend of a friend had introduced us while I was researching a subject that's gripped me since the first moment my ears first heard of it, namely the Gan, or rather the Afghans, who had been transported en masse to the Australian outback with their camels in the early 1800s. In the age of empire and long before the transcontinental railroads, affordable transport was needed to move anything and everything across the bleak and inhospitable Australian hinterland. I can imagine a gaggle of colonial types in their starched shirts with wing collars and neckties, dreaming up what, for them and for the empire, seemed like an obvious solution. Afghans. In actual fact, the droves of camel ears who were transported were brought from a vast swathe of what was then the northwest frontier of British India and, of course, Afghanistan itself. The singular characteristic that made the camel ears perfectly suited to the wilds of Australia was their unflinching ability to endure any level of hardship. As for the camels, they were equally suited to the disease, the lack of water, and to the other formidable conditions of the Australian interior. When Yassine Warragul shook my hand that first time, I felt as though I had known him before. And in a way I had, or rather I had known his ancestors in a deep down kind of way, a way that's almost impossible to explain. His build and features were quite unmistakably Afghan, solid and dependable, with an understatement in every detail. Despite the Afghan bearing, there was something else as well, an Aboriginal stoicism and matter-of-factness. Together, this rare combination was so profoundly moving to behold, as though it could only have occurred through divine intervention. Yassine Warragul and I met at Mare, no more than a speck of dust on the map, a full day's travel north of Adelaide. I could only assume that the community had been named after Murray, the prim little English-built hill station in what is now Pakistani Punjab. In my youth, I had taken refuge there from the austere summer heat down on the Pakistani plains. I asked Yassine Warragul if he knew anything of his forebears. He didn't reply, not at first. Instead, he grinned, an enormous piano keyboard grin. It said so much, and yet so little. They were Baluchis, he said at length, or at least that's what I've been told. Came here 150 years ago by ship from Karachi. I've heard the stories, and that's how I know, he said. What do the stories say? I prompted. That the ships were plied with camels and with men who had never left their mountainsides before. They were all violently sick, both camels and men, and then they reached Australia in a terrible state after many weeks on the high seas. I peered out at the desert, which stretched in every direction from the street-side cafe where we were sitting. What do you think they made of all this? I asked. Again, Yassine Warragul grinned. After the high seas, they must have thought they'd reached paradise, he said. All through that afternoon, we talked. We talked about childhood, of expectations and ambitions. We talked of being Afghan, but of being something else as well. And as the long shadows of late afternoon melted into dusk, we talked of what was important in life and what was not. Yassine Warragul had explained how his shared Afghan and Aboriginal roots had provided the ultimate grounding in life. I'm connected to the landscape, he said, and to the starscape as well. I live in dream time, and my veins run not only with blood, but with stories. Stories of your ancestors, I asked. Stories of everything, he replied. Everything you could imagine. As someone who lives for folklore and for stories, I felt my back warm with delight. It was as though there, in that forgotten pin on the map, I had reached the cultural motherlode of humanity. I asked Yassine Warragul whether there was a story, one story that coursed through his veins more than any other. His gaze focused on the tabletop, and he let out a faint sigh. Then he grinned once again, and without looking up, he said, "I'll tell it to you if you like." And that's how I heard it.